So this lecture is on what's called fabric conversion. We're starting this section on fabric conversion, basically taking that grayish good, that term that we learned the first week, like a piece of gray, beige, off-white piece of canvas or linen, and how to convert it through dyeing, printing, and finishing. So fabric conversion. And this is the lecture that we will be looking at today. And your textbook divides it up into two different chapters. The first is on dyeing and printing, and then the next chapter is on finishes. So I'm going to follow along with that on the in-class lecture, and maybe just give you a little more insight to what I think about when I think of different dyes and prints and things that I think are very relevant to us as interior designers. Pre-finishes aren't discussed very much in this particular textbook, but there are certain types of pre-finishes that are in place before a grayish good can be dyed, printed, and finishes. And so those pre-finishes include some dry processes and wet. So from the raw good state, known as the grayish good, a textile must go through several steps to become a finished textile. So here's some examples of finishes that still occur today. And also these are very historical pre-finishes to a textile. So the first being a dry finish, the process called brushing. And brushing is done to pull out the tiny fibers in order to produce a smoother surface. So you can think about brushing that we might even brush with tape or something, our garments, to remove those small fibers to produce a smoother surface. So brushing has been around for a while to smooth the surface. The term singeing. Singeing is a process where cotton, wool, or linen, so note that those are natural fibers. It's a process where those fibers or that fabric is passed over the top of a gas-fired jet in order to burn out vegetable matter. So if you think about singeing, I like the diagram on the left and the right. So this might be a little bit gross, but this is an example of singeing. If you've ever crossed over an open flame and you've singed the top of your hairs on your arm, for example. So that's an example of singeing. So, you smell the burnt hair, but then afterwards, your skin is quite smooth. So that's an example of singeing. So that's the same process that's used for fabrics. So historically, before we had so many chemicals, grayish goods were placed out into the sun to be sun bleached or whitened. So if you even think about kind of older movies, you see people hanging up their white clothes, diapers, and things like that out on a line out in the sun. Well, yes, that was to dry the fabric, but also if it was left over an extended amount of time, then you got a nice, clean, sun-bleached textile. So sun bleaching. There's something called tenter drying. And this involves pulling the fabric tightly, then clamping it to a tenter frame where the fabric dries the stretched tight direction. So this is, it's not ironing, right? But it's rather letting something get wet and then dry and make it more straight. So it's considered a pre-finish. And we do that today still, right? We might, if you're gonna wash wool by hand, which many of us don't, but if you were to wash a delicate by hand, you might just lay it out flat to dry. And although we don't pull it on a tenter frame, we might brush it down to flatten it out and let it dry. Wet finishes include bleaching, which you're familiar with, boiling. So those textiles or fabrics, cotton, wool, they can be boiled to remove wax, gum, grease. We talked about silk is very gummy, and so you want to remove some of those first boiling. A carbonized wet finish is an acid rinsed and dried to remove foreign sticks and grass from the wool. So the carbon literally eats away the sticks and the foreign substances and leaves the wool. So that's carbonized wood. And scoured is just a wet finish, as the term suggests, just washed with soap and water to clean that grayish good before it goes to the conversion process. A term that I would like you to know is the term mercerization, or mercerized cotton, or mercerized linen. We don't get a chance in this class because we're online to look at a lot of fabric labels. But typically, if a fabric was mercerized, it will be listed on the label. And both of you have spent a lot of time looking at Pottery Barn, and Pottery Barn will also let you know if something's been mercerized. So what is that? It's the process of exposing the yarn or fabric to a caustic soda while it is stretched taut on a tenter frame. What happens is that the yarns with this soda, they become very even and very full, lustrous, and as a result, hold the dyes much better. So I think of a little bit of this like when you get your hair dyed. And sometimes you really want it to be clean. You want it to have the fiber of your hair open so that it has that volume and it receives the dye very well. So mercerized cotton is really luxurious and it just really feels good. So the term, we know it has a good hand, a good feel against the skin. So as an interior designer, you can think of the advantage of pre-shrinking grayish goods. So common in cotton, rayon, and wool fabrics, to shrink it before it's printed. So just think about, I mean, yes, that makes sense. You want to make sure that it's pre-shrunk before you make a print on it, because I'm sure most of us have experienced something that you've placed it in the wash, it shrinks, and then you have a shriveled up print on it. So pre-shrinking really quite important for us as interior designers as well. Sizing is a wet finish applied to fibers to enhance their dyeability, to open up the shafts. So today we're going to look at two different forms of color application, dyeing and printing. And when we think about the difference between the two, think about dyeing as more of a stain, while printing is more of a topical application like paint. So I always try to think about a piece of wood that you might stain versus a piece of wood that you might print on top of. So the definition of a dye is a soluble chemical that creates a specific color when it bonds with a particular material. Dyes vary in vulnerability to light exposure, washing, etc., depending on the dye's chemical makeup and the material being colored. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about fibers and how some fibers like cotton or silk that are dyed are more vulnerable to the elements. So here you're looking at dyes in its liquid state on the left and in its powder form on its right. So there's many ways to add dye that will end up being part of a finished textile. So the earliest moment that really a dye can become part of a finished fabric is in its natural fiber state. So when those natural cotton fibers or wool fibers haven't been yet spun into a yarn, they can be dyed. And so you're looking at a vat of fibers on the right that are all being dyed. So they're all the same fiber and they're all being dyed this single color. This is a great way and a thorough method of dyeing. This is one of your test questions, because once those fibers are then, natural fibers are then spun into a yarn, that color is fully penetrated, right? Every fiber is for example, this red color. So when all those fibers are then twisted into a yarn, spun into a yarn, it makes a very thorough color versus starting with a yarn and then dipping that in a dye, which is next. There's a term called fiber stock dyeing, and if you are following along in your textbook, this is swatch number 120. So in swatch number 120, note that this is polyester. So this has been extruded in its dope state and given slubs and nubs to really look like natural fibers that has been stock dyed. So I don't think this book is quite there yet, but again, most natural dyes when we look at for stock dyeing are natural. So what happens? So natural fiber can be dyed before the yarn is spun. Stock dyeing is used with woolen, tweed, and heather yarns in which various colors of stock fibers are blended into a single yarn. So again, this is mostly associated with natural fibers that have been, dyed in different colors and then spun together into yarn. But you can see an example, swatch number 120, that heathered effect is achieved even with polyester fiber. Solution or dope dyeing. So we've talked about synthetic fibers, those made from petroleum-based substances, that they're extruded in their liquid state into long filament fibers. So you're learning a lot this semester, and that's something that you really, I've kind of pushed home a little bit. So think about that. If it could be extruded clear, like a fishing wire, well, it makes sense then that dye can be directly applied during that dope stage. So that clear liquid, basically liquid plastic, you can color that. And so when it's extruded a color. So what does that mean? It means that the color is inherent to the fiber. Therefore, it is the most permanent and uniform of all dyes. An example of yarn dyeing. Yarn is commonly dyed after it's spun. So all those fibers, usually they're that natural cotton, natural linen, they're usually then dyed after they're spun into a yarn. So in this example, what I wanted to show you here is that patterns can be either woven to create the pattern, such as a stripe, with colored yarns, or a stripe can be printed on a fabric through a printing process. So in the example that I'm showing here, you can see that the yarns, if they're wool or if they're cotton, they started out a natural color, and then the entire yarn was dipped into a dye. And so sometimes if you pull away some of those yarns, you can see that they weren't dyed very well. And so sometimes you can see the natural color like towards the center of that yarn. So very much like if you're cooking spaghetti and you don't quite cook the spaghetti long enough and you bite into that spaghetti, you can see the hard center still. So very much similar challenges when you yarn dye. But more importantly, really what I want you to note home is how then different colored yarns can be woven on a loom to create a pattern, such as a stripe. You can see that this is a twill, and you can see the different colors were created through the various yarn colors. So swatch number 121. So this is a yarn dye, and it's a polyester. So let's just read what this says. Yarn dye means that the yarns were dyed and colored yarns were bought together to weave this fabric. The sample is asking you to remove a few yarns to discover that each yarn is a different color. In this fabric, the different colored yarns are in different directions on the fabric. This is a jacquard pattern. Jacquard patterns along with checks and plaids are usually yarn dyed. So swatch number 121 is basically saying the same thing I really want you to understand here. That pattern is created through the weaving process in different colored yarns. If the fabrics didn't have yarn that was dyed and then woven, well, that grayish good, that crummy gray looking fabric can be what's called piece dyed. And piece dyeing is when you dye an entire fabric, a single piece, and you put it through you dip it through a solid color through this vat. And so you can see here's the color. In here, it's being colored from a white color to this fuchsia pink, and then it's being pulled in here. Once dyed, the wet colored goods are washed, dried, and then pressed. So swatch number 122 in your textbook. So this piece dyeing, you have to use a single fiber. So just take a moment and think about that. It needs to be a single fiber, meaning all cotton, all linen, all wool, so that when it's piece dyed as a textile, you have a solid color. Because wool dyes differently than cotton, which dyes differently than silk. So swatch number 122 is cotton. It's been piece dyed. And when you look at sample 122, you can see it's a very consistent overall color, a very solid overall color. We say this over and over as an interior designer, no two dye lots are exactly the same. So if you think about this piece dyeing in sample 122, if that same exact cotton and that same exact color dye was to have been dipped, 6 months later, it would look very close to this khaki color, but it would not be exactly the same. Therefore, designers must take great care to avoid mixing dye lots, particularly in solid color fabrics. So I say it again, when we're in class together and we're working more together with textiles, we can see over and over again that the exact same fabric from Kravet, same color, are slightly off. So the difference between union and cross dye. In order to achieve a solid color, a cloth or yarn, this is the key point, that is made up of two different fibers with an affinity for two different dyeing applications must be dyed twice or union dyed to create a single color. So for example, if this was a combination of wool and cotton, and the manufacturer wanted to get this dye to that really rich, deep blue or indigo. Well, cotton and cotton and wool dye differently. So cotton takes a lot longer than wool to dye. So they have to be double dyed or union dyed to create what looks more uniform. Cloth dyed is only dyed once, but the fiber takes color differently. So if you see a wool cotton blend that you can clearly see the two different yarns, it's because that they were only dyed once. And so therefore the wool and the cotton have more of a mottled effect. And this all makes clear sense if you've ever done any dyeing, right? Even Easter egg dyeing, you can kind of see an egg would dye differently than maybe a brown egg than a white egg or something like that. It just does. Things dye differently. Grayish goods can be made into a product, or more likely grayish yarns, undyed yarns can be actually just made into a product. So thinking about towels, sheets, and then the product can be dyed. And this makes a lot of sense for me. So if you have Vera Wang towels, that you can buy at Macy's or Kohl's or something, maybe it's the same towel. You notice that these at Target, most of the towels in a collection, they look exactly the same, but they're different colors. So that's what product dye means. It means that you can take a product and just dye it in different colors. This is a dip dye example. So in the dip dye example, you can see where the dip is, where the dip dye occurred and where that natural color is above. We're going to go on. We're going to talk about printing and then some different types of ways to add prints to different textiles. So here's just a lovely example of different wall coverings. Wall coverings are printed onto a roll of a vinyl or traditionally paper to create this pattern. So patterns typically will have a repeat, meaning the size of the repeat, how it repeats, and it will have what's called a ground, which is background color. In printing, printing allows color to be applied to specific areas of the fabric to create pattern motifs that are not part of the fabric as it was manufactured. So unlike a stripe that was woven into a textile with different color yarns, we're going to look at stripes that were printed onto a textile. Several printing methods are used, in each with its own advantage and some disadvantages. And so swatches number 124 and 125 in your textbook. So swatch number 124 and 125. So swatch number 124 is a cotton. It's a basic basket weave, and then it has a paisley print on the surface. So if you take a moment to look at the back of the textile, you'll notice that while you can see the print is only on the surface of one side. So you can clearly reverse a fabric and see if it's a print pattern or a woven pattern. Swatch number 125 is called a toile de joie, and toile patterns typically were traditionally block prints from France. And so again, if you turn over the toile pattern, which typically are landscapes of people out in pastoral settings, this one's in a single color, this time green, sometimes it's blue or red, yellow. You can see again that it is a print. And there are different types of printing methods. The first we'll look at is hand printing. So hand printing methods are diverse. They've been, man has sought to make his mark in the world on objects. And so different types of printings on textiles have been around for thousands of years. And what's interesting, in regions seemingly unrelated throughout history, these regions, different cultures, often utilize similar methods to create printed textiles. So cultures, times, and places that have never connected have found ways to print onto textiles in very similar matters. And I always find that very interesting, man. One we'll look at is block printing. So if you're studying history, you're studying history 2, you might have studied the work of William Morris of the Arts and Crafts movement. So William Morris of the Arts and Crafts movement, he was a creative genius. He was a designer, a craftsperson, and he sought to return the craft to the people. So this was following the Industrial Revolution, where things were just made very quickly and often crudely by hand. The arts and crafts movement, sought to bring the artist and the craftsperson back. And so the image that you're looking at on the right is actually a wall covering that was created through block printing, where there was a block or a stamp that the color was applied to a surface. And William Morris, he learned every trade, whether it was how to weave a tapestry, create block print wall covering. He was just a guy who didn't need to sleep. So here you can see how intricate a block design could be. it was the Chinese that perfected block printing. The fabrics that they made were imported to Europe where the method was copied. So if you've heard the term chinoiserie, kind of the European version of Chinese design, they were just fascinated with Chinese block prints. And there was just a Chinese craze that went on, you know, beginning once China opened up its boundaries to the West. And Europe was just fascinated with these Chinese block prints. And it influenced design. So originally blocks were made of wood and later of linoleum. So I'm giving a sign of my age, but in grade school, we used to make block prints, and we used to get a little piece of linoleum and we would cut it out and be able to make a little block. My kids maybe moved to a potato and then actually were able to carve on blocks to create block prints. So wonderful methods to create a design with a raised area. So how this is done is the background design is cut away. So it's the highest area of the block that produces the pattern. So you can see here the back of the block was cut away, and it's going to be the raised area that creates the pattern. So here's examples of block printing today. It's kind of a crafty trade. I don't see it very much as an interior designer, but that doesn't mean that maybe kind of crafts will see kind of a comeback, kind of some of these more folksy designs, and we'll see a lot more of artist craftsmanship in block printing. Also, as interior designers, we don't see a lot of hand painting on textiles. This actually is a hand-painted sunflower on a canvas pillow from Pottery Barn. So hand painting on textiles dates back to the dynasties of ancient Egypt, where it's suspected to be the method of painting textiles found in the tombs. Ancient Chinese and Japanese also painted textiles for centuries. Beautiful paintings on silk that have this fluid watercolor effect. There's also something more of an indirect way of printing. So those block printings, you pretty much stamped a print right on. But there's also a way of printing called resist printing. So if you think about creating an area, some portion of either a stencil or a portion of the fabric will resist the color. So in this class, we're going to look at some popular methods of resist printing and resist dyeing. Screen printing, stencils, icots, and tie-dyes, batik. We'll take a look at some of those. So this is a type of resist where almost opposite of the block print. The area that is cut away when working with a stencil, then you apply color on top. This was just simply done with a crayon. And if we were in class together, we would actually try some of these. Because companies like Ralph Lauren or stencils that you can find at any craft store, they're kind of fun to work with and use a stencil to create a design on a fabric. But a stencil is a cutout area of a thin material where a colored medium is applied. So many of us have probably worked with stencils before. And some of us might have actually done some hand screen printing. So you see a 1950s Brownie troop on the right, or Girl Scout troop. They're printing on top of a yellow or gold color field or ground fabric. In screen printing, the process is much more sophisticated than we looked at with the stencil. The screen consists of a framed box covered on one side with a fine sheer silk. That's what you're looking at here, nylon or polyester. Dyed ink or paste is forced through open cut areas by means of a squeegee. So you can see that the troop leader here, there is places to resist the dye. Dye is placed on top, or a pigment is placed on top, and then a squeegee, much like when you take a shower and you take the water off the shower walls, is forced through the opening. Interior textiles printed by hand screening require perfect alignment and therefore produce one-of-a-kind pieces rather than being suitable for large quantities. So I did take a screen printing class at ASU, and let me just first say, if you use one color to screen your designs through, it's a lot of fun. But as the statement says at the bottom of the page, perfect alignment is required. For example, if you were going to place a second color in between the red. And it was just much too, you're getting to know my personality a little bit better. It was just much too much detail and exactness for this girl. So here's just examples of hand silk screening today. This I could do. Again, this was one color being forced through. In this case, it was yellow. In this case, it's 3 colors, a dark teal, a light blue, and a brown. But you're not trying to get it exactly fit in between a different color. So I could do this, I could do these. And so here's just an example of screen printing. These happen to be put on trays, but the process on textiles is just the same. What I do like, so when I took fabric classes at ASU, I do like resist dyeing. So resist dyeing is a process where you take yarn or a textile and you either clamp it, tie it, twist it, put wax on it, anything to block or resist the dye. So many of us have probably created something, a tie-dye, and tie-dye similar to batik, which we'll look at in a minute, is an old and ancient resist method. So although tie-dye is associated to me with the 60s and 70s, right, where you bunch up a t-shirt and you bind it with rubber bands and then you dip it in different colored dyes, and then when you open it up, all the places that you have the rubber bands, you have kind of groovy circles. So that is the 1960s and 70s tie-dye, but ancient resist methods are very similar. So this is a resist dye technique where tiny little knots were tied in to the textile before it was dipped into dye. And then you unwind some of it and you dip it again and you get these very intricate effects. So knotted, tied, and clamped. So swatch number, let's see what we have here. Swatch number 135 in our textbook. That's an example of a tie-dye. And you know what? My guess that this is probably a print. It's such a fine material, it's hard to tell, but it could be a true tie-dye where the dye actually goes through. Swatch number 136 is a batik. So batik dyeing was probably one of my favorite dyeing methods that when I was in college. And in a batik, it's a resist dye technique, and you apply a pattern using wax. So it's the little beeswax or the little paraffin wax is applied by hand. It was traditionally, we used something that looked something very closely to like a little glue gun, but instead hot little beads of wax came through. And we were able to create these wonderful designs, very intricate and wonderful designs onto a textile. Where the wax is located, that area will resist the dye. So here you're looking at where it's white, that's where the wax was applied. And where it's that indigo color, that's where it was dipped into an indigo color and it still had that true color. So if you're going to ask me, again, if you ever want to try this, there's little kits you can buy at art stores. One color is a lot of fun. The more colors, the more complicated the design becomes. And what becomes more complicated is that as you do multicolors, you have to remove all the wax and then reapply it into areas where you want to do a different color. And that just becomes a lot of work. So, it's not that I didn't like taking these classes. I did get a real appreciation for craftsmanship. I just found that it's not my personality to do something this meaningful. So yes, it is the process. So it's dyed, the wax is then removed. Each color requires application of wax to continue to resist the dye. So if this is yellow and now we're going to dip it in pink and we don't want the yellow pink, you then have to cover all those areas and it's crazy difficult. The beauty is in that hand craftsmanship. So when you're looking at what these crackles, these cracks, you're probably starting to figure out what all those cracks are. And that's part of the natural beauty of batik design, is that wax actually cracks. And at the cracks, when it goes into the dye vat, at those cracks, that dye seeps through, and that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing where all the dye cracked and more of a color seeped through in that area rather than being resisted. And again, that's not a flaw, that's a beauty of the process. So here you have in swatch number 136, a batik, just really, really something lovely. So it probably, where the brown is, they had to probably keep that waxed out so that it didn't get the dark color. And then maybe then they had to go back in and wax in all of the dark blue and green area so that then they could open up where the brown areas, and you can start seeing, and especially if you've ever had to take wax out of your clothes, like if a candle dripped on your clothes, maybe that's why Bobby's asking. It's like, it's not fun to take wax out of a fabric. But what great results. So in Corey's world, I can do one color, and then I appreciate as a designer, as a human, just the skills that are passed down generations to generations. ECOT printing. So whether you want to call it ICAT, ECAT, ECOT, I think it's a tomato kind of word. I call it ECOT because professional fabric and fiber designers at ASU call it ECOT. So I'm going to go with them. So ECOT is a type of warp printing. In warp printing, the warp is actually printed before the fabric is woven. So it's a warp print and it's a resist dye print. Let me try to explain how this is done. Of course, today, most of these are done on a mechanical jacquard loom, or they're prints. They're not done by hand. This is how it's done by hand. Picture a loom, and there's the warp and weft yarns. The warp yarns are the vertical portions of the loom, right? So because it's a resist dye process, each little warp yarn is tightly bound, wrapped, really tightly wrapped where they want to resist color. So let's just look at this one. You have all these warp yarns running down a loop. Everywhere you see white, those yarns were tightly woven around to resist the dye. So instead of wax, actual yarns are just tightly wound around them so they won't get dyed. Then the warp yarns are taken off of the loom, placed into the dye to dye. Then they're brought back to the loom where the weft yarns are woven through. So as a result of this process of moving and twining and taking it around, you get this broken edge effect. And that hazy broken edge motif is really kind of what you can recognize this as an ikat print. So today, warp print effects are sometimes simulated through heat transfer, printing, even woven to look like this. So swatch number 137 in your textbook. I imagine was woven to look like an ikat print. So let's just see what the book says. Ikat is accomplished by tying the individual threads for dyeing before weaving the fabric. This is the most arduous of the resist processes, I agree. Today, this fabric is often imported from Guatemala and Indonesia. Oh my goodness, this might be a real one. So if you pull a yarn, yes. So I just pulled a yarn, and you can see that yarn goes from white to black. Well, you won't be able to see it, but you can try this yourself. So where that white color is, that's where it was tightly twisted around to resist the dye. Here in this example, you can see, so the warp yarns, right? So here's the weft yarns, those are all the same. The warp yarns have all these different colors to create the design. So I'll ask you, I love working with ikat prints. I think they work very well in our desert environment for interior design. But I will tell you that a lot of my clients aren't attracted to the ikat print. Again, I find it very beautiful. I like kind of that quality to it, that handmade, that earthiness. But I like to hear from students sometimes. But yeah, sometimes I've presented presentation boards to clients and they want me to take this out, which makes me sad because I'm such a fan. Okay, other ways to dye and to add a pattern or a print, and that is by using something called a discharge fabric. So taking a printing piece, it's almost the opposite of resist dye. So in discharge fabric, we're taking a chemical or solution like bleach and we're removing the color. We're pulling out the color. So maybe in this book, maybe 129. No way. They're saying that 129. Do I have that? Oh yeah, I think so. 129 is an example of a discharge. This is, let's read about this discharge. Discharge is a two-step process. First, the fabric is dyed, usually a dark color. Second, the fabric is printed with a paste that discharges or removes the color. The next roller lays color back in. It is easy to recognize the discharge print because the print is equally visible on both sides. Very nice. So not done by hand, but still an example of a discharge. So then more mechanical printing that we know today, those wonderful prints that create all types of intricate designs are typically are using roller printing. So traditional roller printers where the rollers are engraved, the interior fabric is limited and diminishing this type of process. This vertical type of process is kind of going out, but we'll take a look at some different types of printing. So I probably found the ugliest wallpaper that I could find. You're looking at a wall covering in some type of hotel in Las Vegas. Rotogravure printing or gravure printing. This is a modification of roller printing, but it was developed for non-cloth materials. And it's becoming increasingly popular. So meaning that it's for non-cloth materials. So typically vinyl wall coverings, for example. So the engraved cylinders are usually steel and have been produced to produce large repeats needed for interiors. So these printers are ginormous, okay? So they're not the standard 54 inches wide. They're a lot bigger. So week one, we said that most prints on a bolt come in 54-inch widths. So that has something to do with how either they're woven and then also printing. So now I found this huge print for this ugly interior here. So it requires a different type of engraved cylinder process. And again, it's the most popular method for printing on vinyl wall covering. There's also heat transfer printing. And I like this little example because you can actually see that heat transfer that's going to be placed on top of the actual fabric. So gravure printing is also the preferred method of printing patterns on paper that are later transferred on fabric through heat. So again, look at that size here. You can look at the size, and then here you're looking at that piece of paper that's used for heat transfer. So screen printing, and I lost my image here. In screen printing, a finely woven mesh fabric of silk, nylon, or metal is mounted over a frame. Depending on the design, certain portions of the screen surfaces are blocked out. So that's very similar to what we've seen by hand, right, in that early example. But they also are put several colors into a block or a cylinder. So flat screening is flat. And then roller screen printing is what most of our prints that we find as interior designer, this is the process that we see. So let's just read roller screen printing. Roller screen printing or rotary printing is widely used. It's the fastest method of screen printing. So again, there are areas that are voided, so you can see dark, and then there's areas that have openings where the color can squeeze through. It's fast, it's efficient, and you can do multiple colors because each canister will have a different color. So as that textile is rolled through, a different color is being added to the surface. So just take a look at that. White, purple's been added. Then an orange color, right? Then that green background is pushed through those cylinders until you get that end product. So I wish we were on campus, but what I want to tell you about screen printing is typically what you find is that every color of pigment that was used in the printing of this textile, there'll be little blocks of those colors listed on the side edge, on that side edge. And so you can really go in and look at those little colors, all the colors that were used in a print. So this is just a little more information. I don't think you need it as much for an interior designer, but let's just talk about direct printing, swatch number 126. In direct printing, the foreground is printed on a white or undyed background. This is the simplest and least expensive print, using one less screen as the background is not printed. So here, you have kind of that simple background and you're direct printing on something. So the example that you're looking at here on the screen, this is by Candace Olson. This is a Candace Olson print from Kravet. And so you have this wonderful high quality cotton background, just nice, clean and white. And then all these chairs directly printed on it, direct printing. In blotch printing, In blotch printing, the background area is printed in the same area as the motif. The printed background is called the blotch. So we see this yellow blotch, or perhaps even this white blotch here, and then all of the detail also printed. So printed through roller printing and then printed with all of these different colors. Swatch 127 and it is an example of blotch print. Swatch 128 is an example of overprinting. So as the name suggests, an overprint also has a background color, but in this example, color has been dyed prior to printing. So if you take a look at swatch number 128, notice that that brown color is very pure and thorough through the background color. So you can see that this started out as a dyed brown fabric. And then the intricate design was overprinted on that dyed surface. Here's just a couple of different side notes, but important enough to know as an interior designer, and I'm glad that your textbook included them. So swatch number 130 and number 131. So I'll take a little break. And has anyone ever lived with like flocked wallpaper? Basically, flocked wallpaper looks like it has a flat area and then fuzzy area. So if you take a look at that sample, in my image, this is wallpaper or wall covering. In the textbook, you have an actual fabric. I grew up and I actually had flocked wallpaper in the entry of my parents' home. So a flock print is initially printed with glue, and this is fun to do in person as well. So take glue to basically paint on a pattern. So like glitter, then you actually would, in flock printing, there's a tiny short flocks or fibers that are blown on top of that glue and adhere to the surface. So it almost feels like a raised velvet or a cut velvet, and you get to see that print, but it's actually just little, it's not woven into the fiber, it's actually just adhered to the surface. So that's swatch number 130, and in swatch number 131, you have these little Swiss dots, and the same thing, little dots of glue were placed onto that sheer, and then those short flocks or fibers were then adhered to the surface. You will hear this term quite a bit as an interior designer, the term a burnout. And traditionally, burnouts were created by burning out a different fiber. So let's just look at historically. Historically, the fabric was placed over an open flame. Today, a bleaching agent is used. What happens is when a textile is woven of two different fibers, let's just say silk and rayon or silk and cotton, either a chemical and a flame, with it's a flame, it will burn out one fiber and save and reserve the other. So you can actually burn out areas to create these designs. So burnouts are used in window treatments because it's kind of nice if you want to have a pattern and you just don't want a solid sheer. So burnouts. 132 and 133. You've already been introduced to some of these color problems: bleeding, crocking, migration, fading, tendering, and metamerism. I don't think I use that one much. Two items match under one light source but not another. Oh yeah, that could be a problem.